Welcome back to Philosophy for Flourishing, the show where we investigate principles and practices for living the best, most fulfilling life possible. I recently spoke to the organizational psychologist and best-selling author, Adam Grant. He's written Give and Take, Originals, and most recently, Think Again, which I reviewed in Quillette. We talked about writing, about how he threw out 100,000 words of his first book and basically started over. We talked about the need for clarity and how unclear writing is a sign of unclear thinking. One of the really cool things he told me was about his writing process and how he developed it, starting in, I think it was grad school. He had a professor who taught a course on the craft of scholarship, Carl Weick. Carl taught that no matter how complex your idea is, you've got to be able to boil it down to a single, clear, concise sentence. It should be that you could communicate this idea and convince your grandmother of it. And I love this because it mirrors one of the things that I teach in the writing class at Objective Standard Institute, How to Write Powerfully in Defense of Liberty. It mirrors exactly what we do there. And so we hit it off on writing. We also talked about persuasion and how to apply some of the principles that he teaches in Think Again, because some of those principles, if you read the book, are meant for verbal communication when you can sit down and have a conversation with someone. And so it's not immediately obvious how some of those ideas can be applied when you don't get that opportunity to sit down and speak with somebody, when you're actually trying to write something that will help change someone's mind. And one of the distinctions that he made there that I absolutely loved is between ignorant simplicity and elegant simplicity. So if you're interested in that stuff, definitely check out the interview. It's at theobjectivestandard.com. But the thing I wanted to talk about today relates to another subject that we delved into, which is rational self-interest. And this came up because Adam wrote a book, his first book, in fact, called Give and Take. He says that givers are people who are on the premise of always asking, what can I do for you? And that takers are just the opposite. They want to know, what can you do for me? So this kind of boils down to JFK's famous speech, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, right? And then there's a third category called matchers, who are not honored by being included in the book's title, Give and Take. But there is a third category, and they're characterized by this behavior of tit for tat, of I'll do for you on the expectation that you'll do something equal for me. And the key message of Give and Take is that not only do givers tend to be among the least successful people, they also make up the greatest proportion of the most successful people. So that's kind of a head scratcher. So why is that? And it turns out that there's this really important distinction between successful and unsuccessful givers that Grant makes in the book. And it's that unsuccessful givers tend to sacrifice their values for other people. They're on this premise of asking always, what can I do for you? And there's no limit to that. Successful givers, by contrast, are interested in helping other people, but not at the cost of their own values. They aren't willing to sacrifice their own values in order to help other people. And when we started talking about this immediately reminded me of Ayn Rand, who was this arch advocate of selfishness. She wrote a book called The Virtue of Selfishness. And people commonly associate selfishness with the taker persona, or sometimes with the matcher persona, but certainly not with the giver persona. The thought is that the person who's concerned with his own self-interest is also not concerned with the interests of other people, that he has little regard for other people, that he's probably not very generous or benevolent. And that's just what selfishness is in conventional thinking. So to be selfish, or to be rationally self-interested on the common understanding, is to be just like Scrooge from Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol. At worst, you are willing to do things that are morally questionable or even downright immoral. And at best, you're on this matcher persona, where you're really always keeping a tally. It's, I don't want to invest too much in this person or in this relationship because I don't know what I'll get out of it. And I want to make sure that I don't get screwed here. I want to make sure I get my fair share. And so the key to understanding where rational self-interest falls in terms of these different personas, I think comes down to understanding the importance of spiritual value, which I touched upon in that interview, but we didn't go into it at any great length. And so that's what I wanted to discuss here. One of the really perceptive things that Adam said on this relates to the difference between successful givers and matchers. He said, matchers expect to zero out the balance sheet in every interaction. They think, I want to make sure every time I help you, I get something back. Whereas the successful giver will think, I will help whenever I can as long as it's not at great personal cost. And in the long run, I'm not going to do that at my own expense. So is the rationally self-interested person a giver, a successful giver, the one that's not sacrificing his own values? Or is he a matcher? And, it's interesting to think about here. Rand, the arch advocate of rational selfishness, counseled people to act on the trader principle, explaining that you should offer value for a value. So is this the same thing as the balance sheet sort of mentality? I would say yes and no. It's complicated. And that's because the typical description of the matcher is of someone who is not very conscious, not very aware of the spiritual value that he gains from interacting with other people. It seems to be, when we think about this balance sheet metaphor, that we're talking dollars and cents or some other sort of material value. And if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for instance, it's obvious that we need lots of material values to live our lives. We need food, water, shelter. We want soap to wash our bodies. We want a car to get from point A to point B. These are all material values. But we are beings of mind and body, and we have lots of mental needs. I mean, this is why we have psychologists, right? And if you think back to the show that I did with my friend, the psychologist Ellen Kenner, we talked about gratitude. Gratitude is a spiritual value. It's something that exists at the psychological level. Friendship is a spiritual value. Art is a spiritual value. It paints this picture of a world that we would like to live in. It inspires us to do great things in our own lives. So spiritual values are hugely important in our lives. And I think that the typical characterization of the matcher is someone that doesn't really think very much about spiritual values. They're only focused on material values. So if we accept this characterization of the matcher as someone that's not very in tune with his own psychological needs, with the spiritual values that are possible to him, with the spiritual values that he can gain by helping other people, then we'd have to conclude that the rationally self-interested person is not a matcher on that characterization. That being said, I'm not sure that we should accept this characterization of the matcher. It's not immediately obvious to me that we should. Perhaps we ought to rethink what a matcher is in terms of someone who is cognizant both of material and spiritual values. In any case, I'm not really here to argue for a specific definition of the matcher or the successful giver. I think that if I were to name this person, the one who's cognizant both of material and spiritual values and acts accordingly, I would probably just call him a trader like Rand did, Trader, not Traitor, of course. A trader, but somebody who is on the trader principle, who gives value for value, both at the material and spiritual level. But I don't really think that what we're calling this person is all that important. I just think that these categories that Grant uses are a really interesting entry point into a conversation about rational self-interest and about success, about what it requires, long-term success. And the lesson that I get from the empirical studies that were conducted and relayed in Grant's book, Give and Take, the lesson that I take from that is that if you want to flourish, you can't disregard the role of spiritual values in your life. In fact, you must work to achieve a great deal of spiritual values. And doing that will cost you some material values, and it will cost you some time, and that's just part of the trade-off. So here's a for instance that I think really serves my long-term rational self-interest. Even though it costs me some material value, it more than makes up for that in spiritual value. For the last 6 months or so, actually longer, probably about a year now, I've been helping a friend record an album. And I actually built a studio in my basement, and I've been helping him record his music, and I've even been contributing some to the music. But I wouldn't ask my friend to pay me for studio time to come down here and record his music. I love what he's doing, and I want to help him however I can. I want him to be super successful. And I just take huge pleasure in the process and hanging out with him. He's a hilarious guy, and his music is great. So it's both the process and it's the outcome. And I'm not looking to make a buck on this. I'm just having fun. And this definitely serves my long-term self-interest. It would be against my long-term self-interest to be a penny pincher in this scenario and to be like, hey, can you start paying me, $100 an hour or something to come down here and record? That would be ridiculous. And it would be bizarre because it would totally be throwing out the window our whole friendship and the values that we both get from this. And people do this sort of thing all the time. You pick up the tab for your friend at dinner because you haven't seen him in a while and you just appreciate his company. You're getting rid of some stuff at your house and you could put it on Craigslist and make some money. But then you think, oh, I think my friend Tom could use this, or my mom could. And sometimes, at least some of us, do similar things for complete strangers. I know I do. When I see potential in someone and there's something that I can do to help them, I do try to do that. So just as a for instance, I don't do this regularly, but the other day there was a girl outside of Panera who was soliciting money to help her go to college. We talked for a few minutes. It seemed like she was a rational person on her way up in the world. It seemed like she was going in the right direction. And so I had a few extra bucks in cash, and I was happy to contribute that to her college fund. And it felt great because I've reached a point in my life that I have enough money, and so I don't have to sacrifice any of my values to give to a cause that I think is worthwhile. And it gives me a sense of satisfaction and enjoyment to do that. So I gain from that interaction. If it was a choice between helping this stranger and having enough money to eat lunch that day, then of course that would be a sacrifice and I wouldn't do it. But that's not what we're talking about. That's not something I do all the time, but an example of something that I do more often is help people who send me their writing, particularly if it's a young person who's interested in promoting the ideas that I think freedom and flourishing depend on. I'll often go way out of my way to help such people. I'll get on the phone with them, I'll talk them through writing problems, and essentially just try to share with them what I wish I knew when I was in a similar position. And I don't charge young people in whom I see a lot of potential for this sort of thing. I do it because it gives me great joy to see them go on and do things that I think are really valuable afterward. And people have done this for me. I'm sort of paying it forward, and I'm happy to do it. Will one of these people someday end up in an incredible position and be able to help me out? Perhaps, but that's not what's going into this mental calculation here. I'm not thinking, well, I've got to diversify my portfolio, so to speak, and invest in all of these different people such that I can take advantage of whatever sorts of perks come with that down the road. If that happens, great. But I'm doing it for the spiritual value that I get right now. And given that we're beings of both body and mind, we can't possibly achieve success or flourishing by ignoring one and focusing solely on the other. The takers and matchers of the world, the Scrooges, are demonstration enough that that sort of outlook doesn't work. Nor does it work to focus solely on the spiritual. You can't live without the material values. We need both. I came across an interesting Bible passage recently that appears to counsel to do just that, to completely forget man's physical needs. It says in Luke, "Take heed and beware of covetousness, For a man's life consists not in the abundance of the things which he possesses. Consider the lilies, how they grow. They toil not, they spin not. And yet I say unto you that Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. And seek not ye what ye shall eat, or what ye shall drink. Neither be ye of doubtful mind, but rather seek the kingdom of God. And all these things shall be added unto you. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. In other words, if we were to formulate this one passage as a principle to live by, it would be, if you want to be good, don't selfishly focus on acquiring material possessions. In fact, any regard with material possessions, even for what you're going to eat or drink this very day, is bad. Don't worry about that stuff. God takes care of his flock. Be like the lilies. They toil not, they spin not, yet they are better clothed than kings. And I say to this that we're going to suffer if we ignore our material needs, just as we're going to suffer if we ignore our spiritual needs. So my take-home point here is if you want to flourish, you can't disregard the role of spiritual values in your life, and you've got to work to achieve a great deal of them, and those might cost you some material values. If you're enjoying the show, please give us a rating and subscribe. It's small, but it really does go a long way, and I much appreciate it. You can email me with your questions and comments at john@objectivestandard.org, john@objectivestandard.org. That's Jon, no H. Until next time, happy flourishing.